Hello, and welcome to It's Going to Be All Right. I am Niklas Minterovic.
And I'm Clayton Gwen.
And it's time for another show, another podcast.
That it is. And we're going to try something different this time, aren't we?
We made like a plan, and then I opened the document that you sent me this morning, and then I saw that you have chosen an abstract that was very interesting. So I got super excited about this podcast, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. And so before we spill the beans and spoil what the abstract is and where it comes from and what it's about, we thought it would be a little bit fun to try, instead of just talking through ideas about writing, that we could actually sit and just work together to analyze a document and sort of put these ideas we've had over the last 4 episodes into something that's a little bit more practicable, I guess you could say. This is going to be a little bit difficult for our listeners, but I will make sure that we link this article in the show description so that you can actually go and look at this yourself for your own reference. So we're going to try to analyze the abstract, and we're going to talk about ideas of structure and composition and audience,
a lot of different stuff. And as you said,
SEEC, structure, cohesion
aspect
of ideas, clarity of
also
the ideas, and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah. Yes. And I think that's where this is really good. So why don't we introduce this article? It comes from the Clinical Microbiological Reviews journal, which, according to their website, is a journal that analyzes the latest developments in clinical microbiology and immunology. Key topics include pathogenic mechanisms, individual and groups of microbial pathogens, clinical and laboratory aspects of newly recognized and re-emerging infectious diseases, antimicrobial agents and their applications, and diagnostic laboratory technologies. So for those of you who are like Niklas and I, and not medical experts or clinical microbiologists, maybe you're already understanding why we might have chosen such a journal and an article that comes from it. What do you think?
I mean, I don't know too much about the stuff that you just, mentioned, but when reading through the abstract that we're going to analyze today, this one is very interesting, and I think it's a good example of being able to explain something that is rather complicated to a relatively broad audience by choosing your words carefully.
Mm-hmm. And so I really selected this article for 2 reasons. One, this article was actually published in October of 2007. So it's 13 years old. The title of it is Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus as an Agent of Emerging and Re-emerging Infection. So I thought it would be a little bit timely to look at information on coronaviruses, particularly when we know that we have so much information on something like SARS, which to my knowledge is rather similar to the current COVID-19 coronavirus that we're facing at the moment. And I thought that it would be good to sort of have this retroactive look at some of the science around a similar virus and see how that might associate to science and understanding today. But also I chose it because we're not experts in this field, so that we're not going to necessarily get caught up in the content that's in there, that we can really take our time to look at how these ideas are being presented, and it will hopefully make it easier for you and I to actually analyze this abstract and discuss things of structure and construction, all of that.
Yes. And on a side, this is, when I was a kid, that was when the SARS outbreak happened in 2003. I was not a kid. I was in my early teens. And To be honest, I might risk sounding relatively unintelligent right now, but I was never sure what SARS was an abbreviation of. So
Yeah.
it's really nice to okay, severe acute respiratory syndrome. That's what it is.
Hmm.
And that's
And as
unfortunately
young
what some people are
teenagers,
experiencing now.
yeah. And as young teenagers, I remember that as well because I grew up in rural Canada and we had many severe cases and areas of the country were shut down, predominantly, if I remember correctly, the city of Vancouver, and like the hotspot in Canada was the city of Toronto.
Okay.
So in a way, I didn't really live through any of this, but being able to look back, and another reason why I chose this article is I'm going to just read something very quickly that came out of the conclusion of this, that this article, I think, has been making its rounds through social media. So some of you might have seen this, but the thing that really got me when I've actually read through the majority of this article, and the conclusion really comes out to this point that the presence of a large reservoir of SARS-CoV, so the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, and similar viruses in horseshoe bats, together with the culture of eating exotic mammals in southern China, is a time bomb. The possibility of the reemergence of SARS and other novel viruses from animals or laboratories, and therefore the need for preparedness, should not be ignored. Now, this was written in 2007.
2007.
Yeah.
But maybe we should start out with reading the abstract out loud, and then we
Yes.
could kind of just go back and talk about certain aspects of it. Maybe that's a good idea.
And the implication, this, I just want to let you know, this is partly why I chose this, because we have seen a reemergence, and I think it kind of makes sense to have an article like this that for those listeners who would be interested in actually reading it, there's a good excuse to go and read the article. But do you want me to read the abstract since I have the document in front of me already, or do you want to do that?
I also have the document in front of me, but you could do it because you are the native English speaker.
Because I'm the one with the radio voice.
I guess.
So the authors Cheng, Lao, Wu, and Yuen from 2017 wrote as their abstract for this article, and I quote as follows. Before the emergence of severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, coronavirus, abbreviated SARS-CoV, in 2003, only 12 other animal or human coronaviruses were known. The discovery of this virus was soon followed by the discovery of the civet and bat SARS-CoV and the human coronaviruses NL63 and HKU1. Surveillance of coronaviruses in many animal species has increased the number on the list of coronaviruses to at least 36. The explosive nature of the first SARS epidemic, the high mortality, its transient reemergence a year later, and economic disruptions led to a rush on research of the epidemiological, clinical, pathological, immunological, virological, and other basic scientific aspects of the virus and the disease. This research resulted in over 4,000 publications, only some of the most representative works of which could be reviewed in this article. The marked increase in the understanding of the virus and the disease within such a short time has allowed the development of diagnostic tests, animal models, antivirals, vaccines, and epidemiological and infection control measures, which could prove to be useful in randomized control trials if SARS should return. The findings that horseshoe bats are the natural reservoir of SARS-CoV-like viruses and that civets are the amplification host highlight the importance of wildlife and biosecurity in farms and wet markets, which can serve as the source and amplification centers for emerging infections. What a mouthful. End quote.
Oh, yes. And I also think that the ones who are listening, they should at this point be able to pull up the article if you're not driving your car or something like that. So we will include a link in the description below, and then you could just take a look at this article as we talk about it. That will make it a lot easier, I think, to follow, which sentence we're talking about and stuff like that.
So what are your initial reactions to this abstract, that we know it comes from a highly specialized medical journal or clinical microbiological journal?
What a story, you know?
Yeah.
It's very accessible to me. And I learned a lot just from the abstract. And there's nothing about it that I don't understand. Like, there's a lot of things that I don't know too much about, but everything that is necessary to understand is clearly explained just within this abstract. And that's something that I find kind of fascinating, to be honest.
So I don't feel like they're very explicit with who their audience is, but who do you think an article like this would be targeted towards?
I mean, this one was written back in 2007, so it's probably for people within the same field, but within the same field, I mean, just within the abstract, it says, led to a rush on research of the epidemiological, clinical, pathological, immunological, virological, and other basic scientific aspects of the virus and the disease. So all these fields, you know, this is relevant for everybody, I think. And today, I mean, I am right now, and so are you, working from home, you know, with headphones in front of your computer with a nice microphone, and so I guess this one is relevant to us all.
Yeah, which again is why I chose it and thought people might find this an interesting read, particularly aspects of the introduction and the discussion and the conclusion.
Oh, yes.
And it's very clearly targeted at people working within clinical research, particularly around virus and disease. But what also really jumped out to me was down in the last sentence of this abstract that it was very, very clearly pointing out not just medical, clinical, microbial science implications. They were pointing out to very economic and very social implications of this virus and what the research has really produced around it. When they say that, it should highlight the importance of wildlife and biosecurity in farms and wet markets, that these places where human-animal interactions are occurring serve as sources of amplification for emerging infections, which to our current knowledge is more or less what has happened with the COVID-19. So we're seeing already the way that this abstract concludes, it's very focused in its audience being the scientific community in clinical microbiology, but they're also very clearly demonstrating the ramifications of this research to a much broader audience. And I think these authors really had that as their intention for how accessible their word choice is just in this abstract alone. Like you said, you didn't get lost reading this, even though you're not a microbiologist.
And there's multiple reasons for that. One is that every field specific, all the specific terminology is by context explained to a certain extent, or to an extent that is good enough to understand why it is mentioned in the abstract. Another thing is that it has the scope is relatively broad. So as you said, it brings up its relevance within clinical science, but also its economic and social consequences of the SARS virus. The thing is that this doesn't really feel like it handles too much at the same time.
No. Because
it tells a story, and it's very easy to follow. Like, this led to this, led to this, led to this. So, and this is what makes this abstract very interesting to me. And so it's very accessible, and all the terminologies explained to a certain extent, or at least enough so you understand why it is mentioned within the abstract. Mm-hmm. And then it ends up in this conclusion that is also very accessible, I think. Because then it's all about...
I have to agree.
because then it's like the findings that horseshoe bats are the natural reservoir for SARS-CoV-like viruses, and that civets are the amplification host, highlights the importance of wildlife and biosecurity in farms and wet markets, which can serve as the source and amplification centers for emerging infections. So, I mean, everything that has been mentioned kind of leads up to this conclusion to a certain extent. I wouldn't be able to guess this conclusion, but everything makes sense when you get there. That the sudden, what do you call it? The sudden, the explosive nature of the SARS epidemic and its social and economical factors, and that it led to a lot of research and all that kind of cooks down to this very, concise conclusion.
Mm-hmm. And there's definitely quite a bit of powerful language, particularly in the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion, that isn't just, technical terms for the clinical microbiological field, and certainly isn't a lot of jargon, just fancy language for the sake of being fancy. There's quite clearly a motive behind this paper as well. Particularly the idea that there could be very severe reemergences of viruses like this because of social and political and economic factors. So in this way, this is something I've really tried to work with a lot of students on their research and say like a master's thesis as well, is what are the implications of your research? Who is going to benefit? Who is going to be able to put this into action? Who needs to know this to make some sort of a change in their field of research or in the broader field or world that they work and live in? And this is one thing that many young researchers don't ever think about. Their main focus, their education, is on garnering results. Do the test, gather results, monitor, evaluate, run statistical analyses, and then talk about what you found. Or, in the social sciences, conduct interviews or surveys, analyze it, apply a theory, and then just discuss what you found. But there's not necessarily that connection to why your findings are important to something beyond it being important to you, finishing your research article or finishing your master's thesis.
I mean, in this case, it's relatively easy to understand why it is important, because the high mortality rate of the SARS epidemic. So, I mean, some projects might have, a much higher degree of difficulty to argue for why it's important. It might not be that important, to be honest, like compared to fighting a pandemic.
Yes. And it also comes down to your audience as well, that if it's more specialized and your findings are something very small and the impact is mostly that you've generated new knowledge, I mean, that's absolutely applicable as well. It's, of course, it becomes harder to take the sort of tone that you hear, which is more of a stylistic approach, I guess you could say, about this article, or as you described it, a narrative. It might be more difficult to craft a narrative when you're writing something that's a little bit more microscopic. And I mean, of course, we're talking about microbiology papers here, so maybe I should choose my words a little bit more carefully.
But its implications are not microscopic. Yeah. And that's why, the thing is that, just to talk a little bit more about the narratological structure, or the narrative, the storytelling. When there's a part of the abstract where it covers all the different consequences, like also the social and economic consequences, and after that, that sentence is elegantly connected to the next sentence where it states that this spawned a need for research that resulted in over 4,000 publications. So that's a really good narratological flow, or storytelling, that it is logically connected. So this led to this violent outbreak resulted in a lot of research, which then again mapped out so much important information about the nature of this of the SARS virus.
And I think that the format of the paper as well, we haven't really discussed that yet, but it's kind of appearing in the journal title, Clinical Microbiology Reviews. So this is a review paper. It's reviewing some of those 4,000 publications. So it becomes a little bit easier in a way to take the narrative standpoint in writing because of the type of article that it is. It is a review paper, so they're needing to put together a lot of different parts to craft the narrative to demonstrate why it's important to conduct this type of review as well. And very often you'll get things like, say, a meta-analysis, which is a form of, it's really just an incredibly systematic literature review to expose current gaps in knowledge, to point out things that might be inadequate or debates that are yet to be resolved, and to just create a better understanding of where the field stands at any given point. And probably, I think we can get in, maybe discuss a bit of the purpose behind this as well, too. Obviously, there's a strong purpose for taking something like a literature review and publishing it with a narrative. This would be, from the case of this publication, 4 years after the first outbreak of SARS, and obviously a couple of years after the resurgence or reemergence of the virus.
This is more of a technical nature, but this is at one point in the abstract, they also kind of limit their scope because they state that this resulted in over 4,000 publications. But after that, they write that we're just going to focus on the most notable ones. And that's the ones that will be reviewed in this article. So that's also a really good way of kind of narrowing your scope a little bit, or a lot, because 4,000 publications is very much, and way too much to take into consideration when writing an article like this.
Exactly. So why don't we go and look at the purpose and see if we could maybe distill the purpose out of this abstract. And we've talked about developing a purpose for your writing or for your research through the framework of a problem, a puzzle, or a gap. And for anyone who might not have heard us talk about that, I'm pretty sure in episode 2, that was where we really got into some of those ideas of pre-writing and forming. What is your research really about? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And why conceptualizing your research as problems, puzzles, or gaps is useful. So you can go and listen to that. We're probably not going to dive into great detail on the concept so much as how can we apply that concept to this abstract, and how do we interpret the purpose of this? So what do you think? Is this a problem, a puzzle, or a gap?
I think that there is a combination. Like so many different research projects. So this is, in a way, it's a puzzle because it's trying to combine information from these different studies, from these different research projects that has been done on the SARS epidemic. But then there is also a problem, and the problem is how to fight the disease and the virus. And then you could also say,
preventing its reemergence.
Yeah, exactly. Preventing its reemergence in another shape, in a mutated variant. And then you could also say that it's a gap if you look back in time, because the rapid explosion of the virus and the high mortality rate and then all this research that was conducted able to deal with this difficult situation.
Yes.
So that's also filling a gap. So in many ways, it's a problem, a puzzle, and a gap at the same time.
Exactly. And we were having a really good discussion with some students the other day who are going through some reviews of term papers and working around these ideas of how sometimes research questions can, very distinctly represent only one. You're looking at a problem. you're looking at a puzzle, you're looking at a gap. But more often than not, you do need to engage with combination of these different ideas. And I think you're right in many ways. I would maybe disagree that it's, I don't think it's so much as trying to focus on a gap as its main purpose. I think you point out a good reason for looking at the gap idea. We didn't know. Oh, sorry, as I bang my microphone here with in my excited jazz hands. So obviously, they present that there was this gap historically with a jump in the numbers from 12 known coronaviruses to 36.
Exactly.
And that 4,000 publications, at least 4,000 publications, came out around this. So I think they're pointing to there was a gap. The gap has more or less been filled at this point. So their research is only showing that their research is possible because there was this gap that's been filled. So I would say that the way I read the abstract is they present that there's a problem. And that problem is really the explosive nature of the SARS epidemic, its first epidemic, and then its reemergence a year later, the economic disruptions that then led to, we need to keep filling this gap. But what they're really doing then is they're using that problem and saying that for us to really be able to solve this problem of how is it that we can be prepared to prevent another reemergence of this infection, we need to take all of that information that had been used by other people to fill the knowledge gap and piece it together like a puzzle to create a clearer understanding of what is it that we really know now, because it's that clearer picture. It's all those different connections between those 4,000 pieces of research that they put together to create a more robust solution. So that's how I would interpret it, that yes, the gap is present, but it's not really their purpose to fill the gap. The gap is just part of the narrative.
That's true.
Yeah, but I mean, this is the fun thing
But they
about
address the gap.
They do address the gap.
And another thing is that this also helped them localize the source of the problem, which is present in the conclusion, where they talk about these, farms and wet markets as amplification centers for emerging infections.
Exactly. And so in that way, they haven't really solved the problem. They've presented a possible solution, but, and we can now tell 13 years later that quite obviously that problem was never fully addressed, and now we have a new problem.
And maybe the gap wasn't filled. That's also an interesting
and now
point
we have
of
new
view.
gaps. We now have new gaps to research. So I just wanted to say I'm not disagreeing with you about how you could interpret that there's still a gap in here, because even though I've read this article, it was a couple of weeks ago, and there was probably sections in there where they might actually have been presenting that there are still gaps, or that they, by piecing those puzzle pieces together, they might have filled a gap that hadn't really fully been addressed yet within the medical discipline.
But it's not their primary focus.
I wouldn't interpret it that way. No.
Yeah,
but this is also the great thing about it is how you choose to interpret this is really up to you. I'm not saying that there is no gap, and I'm not saying that taking a gap stance would be the wrong thing to do. It's just not my interpretation of it. So there's nothing wrong. I think your interpretation is just as valid as well. And that would help you to read the article probably more fully than me, because you'd also be looking for the gap filling and the new knowledge that's created through the whole article itself. So you might have you might have a more comprehensive critical read of the article than I would, because I've sort of omitted the idea that they're trying to fill a gap.
Maybe, but I think the most important aspect here is that we kind of discovered, and this is something that we've been talking about many times, as I said so many times during this podcast series already. We've been talking about everything, it seems like. But the thing is that you can discover, let's say that you piece together information as a puzzle to get a clearer picture, and that picture will show you, will expose a problem or a gap, like a missing piece to the puzzle.
Exactly.
So this is kind of an example of that we read it a little bit differently. And it's also really interesting to see this kind of see it in the context of our present situation. Like, have the gaps been filled? Has it emerged new gaps? Did they get a clear understanding of the situation? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, everything is obviously continuously evolving and coming in different shapes and forms. But the point is that the problem, the puzzle, and the gap can be really intertwined, and they can kind of produce each other and expose each other.
And you say, expose each other. I've just gone down to the conclusion again, because you can pat yourself on the back for this. I'll just read the first two sentences because it really makes a good case for what you were saying. The medical and scientific community demonstrated marvelous efforts in the understanding and control of SARS within a short time, as evident by over 4,000 publications available online. Okay, so they're going back to the introduction. They're going back to the ideas presented in the abstract. So already, I think this conclusion is really quite tight and reflective of a good IMRAD structure. But here's where you can give yourself the thumbs up. Despite these achievements, gaps still exist in terms of the molecular basis of the physical stability and transmissibility of the virus, the molecular and immunological basis of disease pathogenesis in humans, screening tests for early or cryptic SARS cases, on and on and on with a lot of very specialized language. But there you go. There's gaps there.
Wow. Okay, listen now. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a tap on the back. I did it.
So I probably wouldn't have even thought about going and doing that if you hadn't made a good case for there is this hidden purpose that they're still trying to. They're not filling the gaps. I will say that they're definitely exposing gaps, which could have been a hidden purpose from the abstract that I might not have. Well, that I obviously didn't actually pick up on. So, again, just to show, there's many different ways that you can sort of use these problem puzzle gap frameworks to analyze something, and you might be surprised. You could be wrong.
but just, I mean, for the ones who's listening, if you look at your own writing, it could be your outline. Look at it and think about the problems, the puzzle, and the gaps. And then you might discover something new that might be a crucial part of your project, or it might become a very important part of your project. You just have to discover it first. And this could be a really useful tool to kind of expose these different aspects of your research.
And I think the problem, puzzle, gap, and grappling with it, and probably coming to the realization that your research and your research writing is going to actually have an overlap or an integration of two or more of these. Think about how you can use a problem, a puzzle, gap as an integrated framework to create a sense of logical structure for how you present them. And this is a really good idea.
That's true.
So the way I read the abstract, and of course the way that the article itself reads, is they begin with a problem, being the emergence and reemergence of the SARS coronavirus. But their focus isn't really the problem. Their focus isn't really on the problem. Their focus is really more on investigating the research that came out of it, piecing together the puzzles of these 4,000 different publications to fill and even expose gaps that exist there. So they're using the problem as a way of introducing their actual research, what it is they're really trying to get to, which is piecing together these puzzles and, I guess, filling or exposing gaps of things that we still don't know. So these three pieces don't live alone, and they're not mutually exclusive. They can help you think of, depending on my audience, who it is I'm writing for, who is going to benefit or be impacted by this research. How can I hook them in? Because not everybody cares about a gap in knowledge being filled, necessarily. Not everybody cares about getting a clearer picture of something. But if you can demonstrate that there's a problem that's affecting people, they'll probably want to listen. So I think this also serves as a very great example of combining these sorts of perspectives on your research to form a good structure to hook your audience, to introduce the topic and give some, general background information that justifies the research that you're actually doing. Why is it that they're looking through these 4,000 different publications and reviewing the most representative ones?
And just listen to this, because this is also an example of a really good narratological structure that kind of highlights what you're talking about. So the author first they talk about all these 4,000 or over 4,000 publications, and then they kind of limit their scope. But then they continue to delving into the rapidly increased understanding of the virus and the disease resulting from the massive amount of research. So this is a really interesting thing that, like, they highlights how this resulted in so much useful and beneficial research. And then they continue to list some, as I said, some central developments in detecting and fighting the virus and sort of preventing it from coming back. And then also the horseshoe bat. That's something that we've also been talking quite a bit about now.
Yeah, I guess we could look at how their abstract is hinting at, things outside of their field. How this problem is really an interdisciplinary problem, if you wanted to put it that way.
Oh, yeah.
And, there's a few other things that when you have the article up in front of you, it's pretty easy to just dive in and start reading the introduction. But I think that one thing, especially because of how strong the language is, with how they introduce in the abstract and the language that they use in the introduction and in the conclusion, phrases such as the explosive nature, stuff like that, can be really useful to also just go and take a look at who the authors are and, where are they publishing, where are they doing their research. And that can also help you to really kind of figure out, who might their audience actually be. And you don't have to read very far to see that many of these people here, at least the corresponding author, is from the University of Hong Kong with their Department of Microbiology, with the Research Center of Infection and Immunology. And I think that these sorts of things are really important for you to consider too, that maybe some of this strong language and the example that they give. I'm going to jump down to the introduction to sort of demonstrate this a little bit. But the second sentence is the rapid economic growth in southern China has led to an increasing demand for animal proteins, including those from exotic game food animals such as civets. So they've gone from presenting like a global major pandemic of the new millennium, and that's what they present in the very first sentence of their introduction. But then they also very quickly narrow the scope of their intended audience down to China. Now, that's not as evidenced in the abstract.
No, it's not really visible in the abstract.
Yeah. So they kind of use the abstract to, obviously an abstract should be a little bit more general, but you get an even better sense of who the audience is and why this is a problem and why we need to fill these gaps and why their research is important to piece together this, the puzzle of 4,000 different publications to develop a better understanding of what had actually been learned. And it's very clearly targeted at most likely then, obviously, researchers around the world, but with a central focus on China as being an area where these viral outbreaks could very likely reemerge. And of course, that is what we have seen, which is one of the reasons why I thought this was quite an interesting article to bring up.
And it seems like it's also because of what they conclude with in this abstract or in this article, that the lack of biosecurity in farms and wet markets.
Exactly. So there are recommendations being put there that in a subtle way, they're very likely, again, focusing on the Chinese context, and that is what they bring up in both the introduction and the conclusion. But these have ramifications for any type of animal market around the world, not just China, but also the ramifications of the gaps that still exist. This is a good case to continue pursuing research which I'm not an expert in the field, so I honestly can't tell you how much more SARS-CoV research had been done after 2007. I'm sure somebody out there who's listening might know. You can get in touch with us at writing center at nmbu.no and let us know.
Yeah, please inform us, because I have no idea. But I would imagine that there's lots of research going on right now, but in between, like the first SARS outbreak and now, I have no idea.
So we might have to do a little bit of research for our next episode to answer that question for ourselves. But of course, we're not here to look into exactly what these ramifications are. But
it's interesting, it's difficult to hold back.
Exactly. Well, just really the point is to really demonstrate that, your research and your writing can have these sorts of focuses. And a good abstract, if you read a good abstract critically, thinking about these problems, the puzzles and the gaps, thinking about who the intended audience is based off of the type of language that's being used, how easy it is for you to understand it, the flow of the narrative that they're trying to build in the abstract. I mean, all of those things can be a pretty good indication to you of what you can actually pull out as a reader, but also to kind of inform what you could be putting into your research articles as a writer.
I also think that this abstract really showcases how to pull an audience in to what you're writing about. I mean, that might also be because this is very, very relevant for our situation right now, but there's something about the ability or the way they have written this abstract is that they managed to include so many important and central factors that makes it, I think, interesting to a lot of different people with expertise in completely different fields.
Yes. And they do a really good job of following many of the principles of writing that we work with at the Writing Center. They establish context and what the entire article is going to be about quite clearly in the first sentence, in the topic sentence, which is before the emergence of severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus in 2003, only 12 other animal or human coronaviruses were known. So you see, they're kind of hinting towards, okay, there's bound to be more discoveries. At least one more has come up that we didn't know.
There should be like a 13th, at least.
Yeah, exactly. And so obviously, if we didn't know that, well, I guess there's the knowledge gap, right? And with that, the discovery of this virus, okay, so that gap is very evident in the next sentence. They're sort of continuing that train of thought to further demonstrate some of the knowledge that had been built around it, but also that they've closer surveillance of this has led us to find at least 36 of these types of viruses. And then they come towards the real problem. So they're doing such a good job of crafting the connections from something very general, presenting a knowledge gap, down towards how this is quite problematic because of the explosive nature of this virus and that it became an epidemic, and then leading very smoothly towards the puzzle that needs to be pieced together.
But they also make a little bit of suspense in a way, or maybe not suspense is the right word, but surveillance of coronaviruses in many animal species has increased the number on the list of coronaviruses to at least 36, right? So, a lot more than 12. And then the next sentence starts with the explosive nature. So this makes you feel like, okay, so there's that many different types, and are they all that explosive? This is a really good way of building the kind of increase in excitement, I guess.
And I think the abstract itself is very cohesive because they, from that first sentence, are introducing that, okay, there's bound to be more. At least we knew of 12. Now we know that there's 13. And so there kind of stays this central focus on the idea that we really don't yet know all that there is to know about these coronaviruses. And of course, an abstract should always follow the format of your research article, where you are introducing your purpose, you're kind of demonstrating your methodology, which is, of course, that they have reviewed a number of the representative works from the 4,000 publications. They present some of their findings, but they're still very much focused on this idea of obviously developing better knowledge of coronaviruses, and then they're coming towards their conclusion at the end of the abstract by presenting suggestions or recommendations, or at least things that we should be more aware of and cautious of, such as that there are these natural reservoirs and we can amplify the likelihood of infections or infections emerging from these sites and sources. So I think that in that way they do such a good job of really letting you know, obviously, what the whole article is going to be about, but they never sway from the cohesion of the idea. They're always on like developing more knowledge about SARS-CoV.
It's building, and they include new factors all the time that are all very much on point and important. And this abstract kind of, it includes the what, very clearly explained, and it kind of builds throughout the whole abstract, but also why. Why is this important? Why is this research important? Why is this project important? And then how? How are we going to deal with anything like this in the future? Like right now.
And they point out the who, who benefits from this, or who has got their hand in some of the research. And I even wrote show notes on this, and I got so excited to talk about other elements, I totally skipped over it. So that's another thing that you can do as a reader, and also as sort of a critical reader of your own writing, is go back to these questions of, are you really answering, especially when it comes to paragraph construction, what is this paragraph really about? Why is this paragraph really important? How well are you constructing the paragraph, and how well are you giving evidence and examples? All that sort of stuff. And then the who question is really knowing who your audience is, so that you can select the appropriate language, that you can give them the appropriate background information that they need. And these what, why, how, who questions are really useful as well, just to look at something like the abstract, as you said. So,
but the interesting thing about who is that, I mean, just by mentioning things like economic disruptions and all the the social and economical consequences of the SARS outbreak, makes the who, like, there's a lot of people that this is relevant for.
Exactly. It's not just the clinical immunologists.
Exactly. And it seems like they have chosen their words according to kind of their, imagined audience.
Exactly.
Which is a lot of different people.
And that's very likely why it's so clear and understandable for people like you and I, who are, as we've said, we're not experts in this field at all. Mm-hmm. And so this is something you can think of in your own field of research. Are you reading things that are difficult to understand because they're just entirely new and there's a form of technical language that you're yet to fully grasp and understand? Or is it just that it's poorly written? Because there's a big difference between the two of those. I don't think there's anything poorly written about this, and I don't think that, a clinical microbiologist or a virologist or an epidemiologist would read this and say, oh, this is crap. It's written way too simply. No specialist is going to read this and benefit from it. I don't think anybody would say that about this article.
I don't think so either, but obviously I don't really know. But what I do think is that this writing an article or an abstract like this with, choosing this kind of language makes cross-disciplinary studies much more easy to do, because people like me, who's, I'm more of a history kind of sociology kind of guy, and so that would make a lot of research much more accessible for me and my research if this was something that I would, wanted to work on.
Exactly. This could be something that, for someone like me as well, too, working in restoration, ecology, and social management of ecosystems. This is something that you can look at and, okay, maybe you're looking at the management of wild animals in a fairly contained area where there's a high likelihood of human-wildlife interactions. Maybe these are things that suddenly you can be aware of in that type of management. Oh, there's epidemiological consequences of, preserving sites for certain types of animals. And if you're designing, say, a reclamation site for human recreational use, and you have bats there, maybe this is something you should be aware of. So it does becomes easier to spread the message.
Exactly, or just, you could connect this to different social consequences. For example, as we did yesterday, we had this workshop. We were using Zoom, just like Teams, Microsoft Teams or Skype, right? So that has its pedagogical consequences. So using a language that is very accessible makes cross-disciplinary studies much more, easy to do.
Mm-hmm. And this isn't to say that you can't write in a very specialized language either if your audience is very focused, if it is information and research that is really designed to help a niche field. You shouldn't feel bad about having your writing be inaccessible. But you should be aware, at least as a reader and as a writer, who is the intended audience of this article. Is it somebody like me with my background and my knowledge? And if it's difficult to read, it's probably coming down to the choice of either it's for a much more technical audience than you are a part of, but always keep in mind that it could just also be very poorly written. And that's kind of for you to decide as a reader, I suppose.
But here I get the feeling that they kind of invite lots of different people that feel affected by this in some kind of way to take part in research within their specific field. If that could be, if that could help in any significant way.
And so there was an activity that I had ended up helping some of our veterinary postdocs and PhDs run as part of workshops they were doing with their department. And I had said to them, one way that you can get people to think a little bit more generally about their research and communicate it more clearly is just get them to write an abstract. Get them to write the elevator pitch in a way. And having this sense of within your abstract, you should be able to know what your topic really is, why your topic and your research is important. You should know how you're going to present that. So what is the format? Can you take a narrative? Is it a review? Is it an original piece of statistical or empirical research? So what is sort of the format there? But most importantly, who cares about it? And then you start working with your problem, your puzzle, or your gap, and you use all of those ideas to craft your abstract, 200, 300 words. And in a way, it's sort of like what we had talked about in a previous episode, I think the last episode, of just like practical writing processes. Why is an introduction so hard to write? It's usually because you might not have a full outline. And so an abstract in that same way can kind of work like an outline to just distill all of your ideas to their essence that answer what, why, how, for who, and is it a problem, a puzzle, a gap, or a combination of any of those. And at least I've found that to be really helpful to make me a better researcher, a better writer, definitely a better reader as well.
And you could definitely, you could write abstracts long before your project is done, just as an exercise, just to kind of condense your ideas, try to connect the dots, and that could change certain things in your outline to the better.
Absolutely. So,
and you could do it many times. You could kind of, as we talked about with making the ultimate list and kind of distilling the points down to its essence. You could do the same thing with rewriting an abstract and then alter your outline accordingly.
Yeah. And I mean, there's many, many ways in which you could do that to revise and improve and continuously improve and improve and improve. These are all just things that you can do as part of your practice while you're sitting there in the reading process, refining your research questions in this sort of way, engaging with the literature that you're reading and trying to dissect it and deconstruct it to really pick out these sorts of things. Who is this written for? Why is this research important for that particular audience? How is it being constructed? How is it being told to me? All of that sort of stuff. And is it a problem, a puzzle, or a gap? And I mean, I feel like maybe we've just beaten this abstract to death at this point. I don't know if there's much more that we could do to it. I feel like we've more or less covered. Yeah, we're coming back to the same things again and again. Yeah. They call that saturation.
Saturation, yeah.
We've achieved saturation, Niklas.
Which is probably a good thing, but that also means that it's probably going to be all right.
It's probably going to be all right. No, it's going to be
all right. It's
going
to be all right. Yeah. It's yeah. It's yeah. It's yeah. It's yeah. It's yeah.